Hey everybody, welcome to class today. This is our second to final class. Next week it'll be more open forum, Q&A, practical application, stuff like that. Today we're talking peace, the peace pillar. And I use the word peace because I believe we can truly be at peace, despite our circumstances even. And when we are in a state of peace, we have our natural physiology that functions more optimally when we're at peace as opposed to stress, fight or flight. And so we'll get into this today, but I want you to keep in mind, even from the get-go here, there's stress management, just like there's chronic disease management, versus a state of true peace. So that's two distinct things, stress management techniques versus true peace. And as we'll see, being at true peace all the time, despite your circumstances, it can be a challenge, a huge challenge. But as we mature, I think we should be able to get to that place or get closer and closer to it. And the more mature we get and the closer we get to true peace, the less we'll have to utilize stress management techniques. So I don't want to come across as anti-stress management techniques, but also live in the real world that if that's all we talk about, people will latch onto those and that's all they'll do, and they won't be optimal. You won't get all the way well if you stay in the land of management. And it's just like with blood sugar. You can manage a diabetic's blood sugar to the best of your ability and keep it kind of normal-ish or close to it, but still that patient is at risk for all the complications of diabetes. Heart attack, stroke, cancer, etc. Eye problems, kidney problems, ulcers on their feet, amputation, dialysis, all that stuff. So management is definitely not the goal, but you meet people where they're at, you manage them while you need to manage them, but you're always pointing them to the cure, which really is their body fixing itself. So a few studies to start with. I think we all intuitively understand stress is not good. Stress is going to lead to disease and illness, but it's always cool to see some studies that actually link it. And this study from 2017 looked at heart disease and stroke and could specifically link increased stress with increased heart attack and stroke. And here's one that connected. This was a big study with lots of patients, over 1 million people, a 30-year study, and it connected stress, chronic stress, with autoimmunity. A very big connection between those two. In fact, in my world of what we call functional medicine, most functional medicine doctors agree that all autoimmune disease patients, regardless of if it's thyroid autoimmune, which would be Hashimoto's, or joints, which is rheumatoid arthritis, or skin, like a psoriasis, or ulcerative colitis in the colon, or whatever, MS in the brain. These are all autoimmune diseases. The immune system's dysfunctional. And pretty much across the board, I think every integrative and functional practitioner agrees that leaky gut and stress are two common components in every single autoimmune patient. Here's a study specifically about loneliness doubles your risk of type 2 diabetes. Now, I put loneliness in the category of stress because that's what loneliness is inducing, the state of emotional thinking or emotional state that the body interprets as stress. And as I mentioned in the movement video last week, stress can even be quote-unquote good stuff like exercise. Those long-distance marathon, triathlete type events, those are stressors on the body if you do that repetitively and ongoing. So short bursts of acute stressors like exercise, lifting weights for a few minutes, that's going to stress those muscles, but in a good way. It causes those muscles to break down some, but it stimulates the regrowth process to happen. So short bursts of little acute stressors here and there actually do keep the immune system and your full body systems functioning well. So we're talking more the chronic, daily, ongoing, day after day, week after week, month after month, chronic stress. And that's the type of stress this study looked at, doubling the risk of diabetes. Here's another loneliness one. And right now I think loneliness is a very good thing to talk about because of the way everyone's quarantined, the way everyone's having to socially distance. It saddened me today. I was driving to work, and we live outside of town, and was driving through the east side of Lubbock, which is a more sparsely populated and kind of more of a rundown part of the city. So not many people out and about on the streets of East Lubbock. And I was driving by and this guy was walking down the street, getting his daily walk in, had a hoodie on, had a mask on, had his cane. I mean, this guy was covered up. You could barely even see him. And with this mask for COVID-19, and there's not a soul around him. There's no one within a mile around him. There's no cars on the street. There's no people walking. This guy was just so isolated and lonely, but even more so with all this garb on. Man, we're just like forcing this loneliness onto people. But this study talks about loneliness rivaling smoking and obesity as far as your longevity goes. So it's a big deal. Your emotional state is a big deal. This study took loneliness to the next step, and it looked deeper at how does it damage your health, and it's this inflammation gets triggered. So we go back to that root of all disease we talked about earlier in our series here. The inflammation's the common denominator of all disease. So if you Google your disease or your symptom or any disease or symptom and the word inflammation, you'll see a lot of links because we now know that's an underlying common denominator, inflammation. And here's another one, the Harvard, out of Harvard Medical School. So uncovering the link between the emotional stress and heart disease, and the subtitle here, the brain's fear center may trigger inflammation and lead to a heart attack. So again, that word inflammation coming up, and what these studies are starting to do is link this emotional state of stress to inflammation. And again, another one, how stress influences disease. This is a 2012 study out of Carnegie Mellon. Inflammation, that's the culprit. Stress and inflammation. There's this link again we're seeing with inflammation. And remember, I hope this is a take-home message for this class. When you hear the word inflammation with any headline for any medical disease, think mitochondria. Mitochondria and inflammation integrally related. And here's the graphic I've showed you before, I think. Where is mitochondrial disease? It's everywhere. It's pretty much all diseases is mitochondrial disease. You could insert inflammation. So let's just review that. I always like to take the opportunity to drive this home. I want y'all to all be able to draw this once you're graduated from this little class. The cell, the mitochondria is the carburetor, and that carburetor needs three things. Fuel, just like the carburetor in your vehicle needs fuel, and it needs air from what you breathe. Remember the movement lecture. And then we need the spark plug, that's the minerals, specifically copper and magnesium. There are other minerals, but those are the big ones. And when all that comes together, you get combustion. Combustion produces ATP, that's your energy. But just like in your vehicle, when you produce energy, you also produce exhaust. And the exhaust, we call it free radicals. That is what inflammation, that is where inflammation is coming from. Free rads, I'll put. But remember, we have an antioxidant enzyme. Remember, enzymes are the workers. We talk about building a cell, you got to have the raw materials, the vitamins and everything, proteins, fats, the raw materials, but then you need the workers. Remember the automobile facilities in Detroit. You got the raw materials at the front door of the factory, but you need the workers, that's your enzymes. Those workers need energy. Energy is really coming off your minerals. The minerals turn these enzymes on and make them work. So these enzymes down here, these antioxidant enzymes, they run mostly off mag and copper, but these antioxidant enzymes come up here and they deal with your free radicals. They deal with that exhaust. So when you see the word inflammation, stress triggers inflammation, or inflammation is linked to any disease, you need to be thinking about there's too much exhaust. Inflammation equals too much exhaust. What's wrong with my antioxidant enzyme system? And usually not or, but both, what's wrong with my mitochondria? The mitochondria should be very, very tuned up, very, very efficient. And remember, a tuned up mitochondria is one that burns fat for fuel. And you can burn carb for fuel, but remember, fat gives you 140 miles a gallon versus carb will give you about 32 miles a gallon. You need to be able to flip back and forth between those two. Most Americans are stuck chronically in sugar burn or glucose burn metabolism only because they eat tons of starch. And when you burn you burn glucose or sugar through here all the time and you're only making 32 miles a gallon, you make a lot of extra free radicals. So inflammation equals a mitochondria producing too many free radicals. You don't have enough antioxidant enzymes there to put out the fires of all that free radicals, and those free radicals come in and they will go over here to the DNA that I did not draw, and they can damage that DNA. They can damage the cell membrane. So that in a nutshell is what you need to be thinking when you hear the word inflammation. Think mitochondria. When you think mitochondria, think inefficiency. I'm making too much exhaust. I'm not making enough energy. Usually it's a lack of minerals, and usually it's a lack of the right fuel going in. Minerals run the enzymes to put out the fire, and obviously the fuel gives you the energy, and you need to be able to flip to the fat burn at times. So that's in a nutshell. When you hear stress, inflammation, and disease, here now I want to link where this fear thing comes in, and that previous study I showed you can trigger this whole inflammatory cascade. So when you're in a state of fear, what happens is you change the pH. This is one of the things that happens. This intracellular water that is inside your cell and the extracellular water, the water your cells sit in, the pH starts to change there when you're in fight or flight mode, because when you're in fight or flight mode, your breathing changes. You start breathing shallower and faster. Your heart rate goes up. So you start expending more energy in those mitochondria, and you flip into this sugar burn metabolism when you're in fight or flight mode. And therefore you make more free radicals. But all that translates to a change in pH. The breath change, the heart rate change, and your metabolism changes, and you change your pH, you get more acidic. When you get more acidic, one of the things that can happen is excess iron in the body moves into this system, and magnesium moves out. And that is the key trigger for that inflammatory cascade. That fear center in the brain that the previous study talked about, that's what's getting triggered. Iron triggers that fear center, this part of the brain, and magnesium is the counterbalance to that. But when you're in this acidic state from chronic fight or flight, iron moves in, magnesium moves out, and the fear center is stimulated, and we're off to the races of inflammation. So, to prevent that, number one, we need to not be under stress. We need to try to avoid these stressful circumstances, but what we'll talk about later, more importantly than trying to control circumstances, is controlling your interpretation of those circumstances. But here's the physiology. Here's what is actually happening at the cellular level. Iron moves in, mags out. You're making too many free radicals. You can't neutralize them. That equals inflammation. Okay, another thing to consider, and I want you to know about, and just intuitively, again, I think we understand this, but I'll put a little more facts and science behind it. So when you go into fight or flight mode, which you shouldn't be hardly ever, and I like to think about originally when God created us, and in the Garden of Eden, everything was peaceful and perfect. The lambs were laying down with the lions and all that, and there was just peace, total peace. So there's no fight or flight mode originally. But then, obviously, man decided to go do what he wanted to do on his own terms, and that brought in not God's original intent. And it brought in the opportunity for stress. Our goggles, we decided to put on, I'll call them man goggles. We interpret life now through the lens that's not the truth. So think of it as, your ancestors out hiking down the trail one day and a bear comes across their path. So they have to flip into fight or flight to fight that bear, to kill that bear, or to run. Fight or flight. Fight them or run. But in 5 or 10 minutes, you either killed the bear, or it killed you, or you ran away from it, and the danger's gone. So now you're back into peaceful mode, or rest and digest, some people call it. And you stay in rest and digest or peaceful mode for days, weeks, months, until the next bear comes across your path. So if you only ran across a bear once or twice a year, that's great. You flip into fight or flight for a few minutes, and then you're back to rest and digest. If you have a bear crossing your path, though, 4 or 5 times a day, most days of the week, most weeks of the month, that's chronic stress. So let's look at what happens. three main systems in the body: gut, GI, immune, and hormone systems. Those are the systems, if you think about it, when you cross that bear's path, you don't need to worry about digesting your last meal in that next 5 to 10 minutes of fighting this bear. And you don't need to worry about trying to kill some germs in that 5 minutes of killing that bear. Nor do you really need to worry about producing the 50 to 100 different hormones the body produces to run your normal day-to-day operations. So the body shunts its energy and its resources to other more vital systems in the body, such as your cardiovascular system. When you're in fight or flight, you need to be able to pump blood to all the parts of your body, to your muscles, so you can fight or flight. Your lungs, your pulmonary system, you need to be able to breathe more, get that oxygen in. The eyes, your neurological system, the eyes dilate, your pupils dilate so you can see better. Your muscles get tense. So all these systems upregulate that equip you to fight or to run, but the systems that are more your day-to-day operations, those shut down. So we shut down GI function, immune system function, and hormone function. Probably the top three, if we categorized all the complaints of patients that come see us, and most integrative functional practitioners, that you categorize these patients, they have GI complaints, they have hormone complaints, and they have immune system complaints, almost always. So chronic stress is going to make you prone to having these systems not work right and manifesting as disease or symptoms. I'm going to point out this immune system thing, going back to COVID-19 we're under right now. When people are in fear and fight or flight mode, that immune system gets extremely compromised. So just another reason to be able to be at peace despite circumstances, which again we'll talk about more later. So we're going to break down all three systems: GI, immune, and hormone. So there's this great book called Gut and Psychology Syndrome. If you really want to take a deep dive into this, Dr. Natasha Mcbride, Natasha Campbell Mcbride, MD, she's out of London. Her practice basically consists of heal the gut and you'll heal the brain. As we see in this graphic here, this gut-brain connection. So as an embryo, when you were first being formed in your mother's womb, all the nervous tissue, the neurological tissue was just one ball of tissue. But as you developed and grew in the embryonic stages, that nervous tissue split in two. Half of it went upstairs to the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cords and peripheral nerves. The other half went down into your gut, into the stomach. It's called the enteric nervous system. And there's actually more neurological information coming from the gut up to the brain than there is going from the brain down to the gut. It's amazing. So in medical school, we learn this as the second brain of the human body. It's called the enteric nervous system. Fascinating stuff. So with this amazing connection between gut and brain, Dr. Mcbride decided to work on people's nutritional status and their gut flora, the bacteria in the gut that we've talked about before. They're integral in the production of your neurotransmitters. So serotonin and dopamine and melatonin, these chemicals in the brain that we say get out of balance when someone has depression, anxiety, or whatever psychological problem. And there are changes in those neurotransmitter levels, but a lot of times it's initiated by poor gut function. 80% of the serotonin, maybe even more, is made in the gut. And one of the key steps in that production process is actually dependent upon the gut bacteria. And the proteins like tryptophan that become the building blocks for serotonin and some of these other neurotransmitters, those amino acids come from the food you eat. But you have to be able to break down that protein, turn that steak into steak soup, I often say. And that means you got to have good digestion. You got to have the stomach acid and all the digestive enzymes. The point being, the building blocks for the neurotransmitters and their assembly is dependent upon good digestion and good gut flora. And that's what Dr. Mcbride figured out. And she really stresses gut health. And when she gets her patients to get their gut healthy, as you can see on the book here, depression, schizophrenia, dyslexia, ADD, ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, and there's more. All these brain symptoms or diseases can improve if not completely go into remission. Not 100% of the patients, but a whole lot of them. So it's a great place to start when you're trying to heal someone's brain. When you're in fight or flight, the stomach acid production, those cells that line your stomach lining, called parietal cells, they get turned down, like 50% turned down. So your stomach acid production diminishes greatly when you're under chronic stress. So now your pH in the stomach is not where it needs to be. It's not acidic enough. It's still acidic, like a pH of 4 or 5, but it's not a 1 or 2 where it should be, and that's battery acid levels because of decreased production of stomach acid. So just from that right there, when you turn off stomach acid production, you don't digest that steak or any of your food. You don't close your valves and open your valves, because those valves closing and opening, the valve at the bottom of the food pipe needs to stay shut except when you swallow. And the trigger for that to shut is a very acidic stomach content, a pH of 1 to 2. The valve at the bottom of the stomach, for it to open and let the food pass to the intestine, again, the pH has to be 1 to 2 to trigger the opening of that valve. The gallbladder's got to squeeze and squirt its enzymes. The trigger for that, contents coming through with a pH of 1 to 2. The pancreas has to squirt its enzymes. Same thing. The trigger for it is a pH of 1 to 2. The motility, the peristalsis of your small bowel, it's dependent upon a good pH. And then the bacteria in the gut are highly compromised. I read a study just the other day on PPIs. PPI stands for proton pump inhibitor. Those are Nexium and Protonix and Prilosec and all those. They shut down the stomach acid production. And this study talked about how that's devastating to your gut flora. It alters the gut flora more than antibiotics do. And we know antibiotics decimate your gut flora, but the PPIs do also, and it's because these gut bugs need the right kind of pH to thrive. So chronic stress just absolutely kills your gut function. Your peristalsis, your digestive juices, all the enzymes, your gut flora, which the gut flora produce enzymes to break the food down. So you can't break food down appropriately under chronic stress, period, end of discussion. You almost can't get a patient better from a GI standpoint if they're under chronic stress. You can manage them. You can give them digestive enzymes supplementally. You can give them some different exercises to try to improve their motility. You can give things to try to get their pH back to where it needs to be, apple cider vinegar, betaine, different things. You can do all sorts of stuff to manage it and try to improve it. You can change their diet. You can give them probiotics. You can do these things, fermented foods. And I'm not saying not to do them for some period of time in the interim, but ultimately they've got to decrease their stress or eliminate it. You can never overcome fully the harmful effects of this chronic stress on your GI system by supplementing probiotics and all these other things. So it's a step in the right direction. But the end game is we've got to get to the root of the stress and deal with it. So, and this kind of side note, leaky gut, if you've heard of that terminology, basically the lining of the intestine, those however many feet, 20 feet of intestine, think of that as a long water hose. But the difference between a water hose that just has two openings, an opening at the top and then an opening at the bottom, that's how it should be in your gut. Leaky gut is, envision one of those permeable, those dripper hoses that have millions of tiny little holes all throughout the hose and the water droplets can drip through. That's leaky gut. Shouldn't be that way. So in a leaky gut situation, you're getting pieces of food, not whole chunks of steak and avocados, but not fully broken down to the amino acid, fatty acid levels, but these pieces of undigested food particles will leak across a leaky gut. And it shouldn't be that way. The food should be fully broken down and then it should be absorbed, transported with an invitation to come through a cell membrane, transported into the body appropriately, where the immune system can check it and see that it's good, it's not a foreign invader, that's an amino acid, that's a fatty acid, that's a mineral, that's a vitamin, come on through, no problem. When you have leaky gut, when you have that permeable water hose, and that's where the cells that line the gut, they touch each other, it's called a tight junction. That tight junction is opened up under chronic stress, and that's where food can leak through. And it leaks through and hits the immune system because 80% of your immune system troops are right inside your gut lining. And they're there to check these foreign invaders. And if it's undigested food, that's a foreigner. And the body makes an antibody to that, and now you're reacting to peanuts or shrimp or broccoli, or I had a patient with 30 different food sensitivities. I mean, that's incompatible with life. You can't be allergic to food. So just avoiding those foods isn't the true full answer. That's a management technique. The answer is seal that leaky gut. Get the digestive function back. Get all the probiotic bugs, good bacteria back so they can help digest the food. Get your stomach acid back. Get your gallbladder and pancreatic function back. But none of that can come back fully again if you're under chronic stress. So hopefully I've driven this point home enough that you get the point. This is super, super important for gut health / immune health, because the gut and brain health, I mean all of it, it's all interconnected, which is another problem with modern Western medicine. If you have a gut issue, you go see the gastroenterologist. If you have a brain issue, you go see the neurologist. If you have a joint issue, you go see the orthopedic or rheumatologist, whatever. We've divided the body into all these compartments, but it's all connected. Many times a neurological issue or psychological issue is actually a gut issue, i.e. Dr. Mcbride's gut and psychology syndrome. So compartmentalization and treatment of symptoms is not the most beneficial way to treat a person. Okay, the next system after GI is the hormone system. And I'm not going to take as deep of a dive here. I think this graph can kind of explain it. I'm just going to point out all your hormones come from this precursor molecule called cholesterol. So cholesterol goes through a breakdown process into pregnenolone, and pregnenolone gets changed into progesterone, and progesterone can go down here and be made into testosterone and estrogen. And this is a simplified version of this chart. There's a lot more hormones, but the point is cholesterol gets converted into all these different hormones. I'm going to circle this one, cortisol. Cortisol equals your stress hormone. When you're in fight or flight mode, the body's going to make a whole lot more cortisol at the expense of going down this pathway to testosterone and estrogen, and you deplete the progesterone. So testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone are your primary sex hormones, and this is a major, major problem we see with our patients. They have completely depleted their sex hormone levels, and their cortisol will be through the roof. So again, short-term stress, the bear comes across your path, you flip into this, cortisol production, adrenaline, you need that because your heart rate and your breathing, your pupils, all that, you need to fight or flight. But just for a few minutes, you cannot be, you don't need to be, shouldn't be chronically tense, dilated, heart rate up, breathing rate up, and cortisol up, adrenaline up. What happens in a chronic state like that, that cortisol hits your neurons in the brain and damages the brain. So the brain, as a protective mechanism, sends a signal down to your adrenal glands that make cortisol and says, hey, turn down, turn off. Your brain's trying to protect itself from all this cortisol hit from chronic stress. The adrenal glands will turn off then, or turn way down. Well, the problem is they make 50 other hormones besides just cortisol, but they all get downregulated. Again, a protective mechanism. So we get into this cascade effect of total hormone imbalance and even mineral imbalance, because a lot of the hormones from the adrenals have to do or regulate your mineral status. So just a cascade effect. And really, if someone stays elevated in their stress and cortisol, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get them truly well. Again, we try to manage it. There's some herbs you can take. They're called adaptogens. And we'll use these in some patients temporarily, but I really don't like using them long term because it's not beneficial. Eventually they quit working. But ashwagandha and rhodiola and some other herbs can tamp down the cortisol response and kind of help you manage your stress a little better. But long term, we really need to shift this production back to normal and get your progesterone, testosterone, estrogen going in the right direction again. And I do want to point out, I put it in the title here, stress and statins. A good time to talk about statins block right here. This whole cholesterol production pathway. So you will get hormone depletion when you're on a statin. Again, that's another topic, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to remind you, statins are not your friend. Read the book Statin Disaster by Brownstein to go through all the studies. Statins will lower cholesterol, but that does not translate to decreased heart attack and stroke in the vast majority of people. In men who are smokers who have had a heart attack and continue to smoke, it will reduce their future heart attack events a little bit, like 1%. But as far as everyone else, you're just going to have the side effects of the statin. Okay, so we've gone over GI system, hormone system, and just a quick word on the immune system. Ongoing stress, as this article says, severely depresses our immunity. At the same time, it's ramping things up to deal with this emergency situation. So again, acute stress, fine. White blood cell production goes down. That's no problem. You don't need white blood cells to fight a bear. Long term, though, you do need your white blood cells because you're chronically, constantly, every breath you take, you're breathing in germs, even if you're wearing a mask. You're breathing in germs all the time. Germs are on your skin all the time. You touch your mouth, you touch your nose, even if you're trying not to. Every bite of food you take in has germs on it, has bugs, parasites, bacteria, viruses, mold, fungus. 370 trillion viruses live in you, on you, around you, bacteria, 37 plus trillion. So, I mean, we're full of bugs, and most are beneficial. Some are not, and these ones that are not are still in us, but as long as they're balanced, you have enough good guys to balance out your bad guys, then these quote-unquote bad bugs are not a problem. Staph, strep, E. coli, they can be in you and on you, but they're in a balanced way, and so they don't cause problems. And then your white blood cells, your immune system cells, sit there and watch them, and they make sure they stay balanced. If they try to start to overgrow, these guys jump in there and knock them back down. But you've got to have the white blood cells there to do that. So in a chronic stress situation, you turn down white blood cell production somewhere in the neighborhood of 50%. Long term, having your immune system turned down like that, not beneficial at all. All right, shifting gears. So we're halfway through now, and it's a good time to shift into, okay, what do we do about it? So obviously, intuitively, we all knew before class stress is not good for us, but now we have a little more knowledge as to why that is. Shuts down these major systems of the body. So what do you do about it? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on management stuff. In fact, I'll just verbally tell you a few that, again, I endorse, and it's fine, do them, but these are Band-Aids. These are management techniques that should not be looked at as the ultimate answer. So deep breathing exercises, especially in and out your nose. Slow the breathing down. Your exhale doubles your inhale time. Try to hold after the exhale. So breathing techniques, there's lots of different things on YouTube. I might, if we have time at the end, or next week, I'll try to remember to give you some resources next week. There's some breathing kind of experts out there. But breathing techniques, that'll slow the heart rate down. That'll lower the cortisol level. Going outside, hearing birds chirping, sunshine hitting your skin, through your optic nerve to your brain. Just being in nature, the green space, I mentioned that, I think, last week in the movement lecture. Just being outdoors and in nature, there are multiple different ways that will down-regulate your stress response, that cortisol response. So going outside, doing some deep breathing, going on a walk, doing pleasurable, enjoyable things, finding hobbies that you enjoy, whatever that may be, strumming a guitar, singing Kumbaya, and crocheting all at the same time. I'm just kidding. Going fishing, go play golf. You know what it is that you enjoy and that makes you happy. Of course, that's going to drop your stress hormones some if you go do those things. So I recommend you do that. I would even recommend you look at the activities in your life. What are you doing that's driving fight or flight, driving stress, and why are you doing it? And why are you in the job that you're in? If you're only in that job because it has good health insurance, but that's not who God made you to be, you're not supposed to be doing that, you're not utilizing your giftings, and that's not the calling God put on your life, then probably that's always going to feel like toiling as opposed to tending. So if you're in the wrong occupation, yeah, you need to look at that circumstance and change it. So I'm not saying don't look at circumstances and don't try to, I endorse saying no to stuff. I think we're overcommitted, too many extracurricular things. This whole quarantine with COVID-19 has been beneficial from the standpoint of I think a lot of us have learned that a lot of this extracurricular stuff, it was not necessary, especially with our kids. So learn to say no to some stuff. So analyze those circumstances and where you can, change them. That is a piece of it. What I don't endorse, though, is that you just rely on going outside for 10-minute breaks 3 times a day and doing some deep breathing exercises, and then turning right back around and going back into the office and being stressed out for the next 3 hours until your next break, where you can go chill out for 10 minutes and back and forth. Yes, going and chilling out for 10 minutes is more beneficial than not, but we need to be able to not be in fight or flight during the 3 hours back in the office between our breaks. So that's where we get to this topic of circumstances versus the interpretation of the circumstances. That leads us to Bruce Lipton, PhD, cellular biologist. And Bruce Lipton said the cell engages in behavior when its brain, which is the cell membrane, not the nucleus, when the cell membrane responds to environmental signals. So I think I shared with y'all before, Bruce Lipton in the 1960s did some work with embryonic stem cells. So embryonic stem cells are those very first cells when a sperm and egg come together and they start to divide into 2 cells, 4 cells. Those are the cells that are identical. Same DNA, identical cells. So he took those and put them into different petri dishes, and he changed the environment of each petri dish. So the pH, the temperature, the oxygen content, 3 different petri dishes, different environmental factors, same cells, same genes, and he let them grow and grow and grow and grow. The first petri dish turned into muscle, the second one turned into skin, and the third one into bone or something like that. So his discovery, that was the first of its kind, was proving that it's the environment that influences which genes turn on and off and determine the fate of that cell. And so that's in the 1960s. He's continued his work all these decades, and then in, I think it was the 90s, when he was doing work on thoughts and the stress response. So he put Miss Jones and Miss Smith into the same stressful circumstances, and he watched their response, fight or flight response versus rest and digest. So same external stimuli, external stressors, and they both flipped into fight or flight. Miss Jones, though, in 10 minutes, flipped back into her parasympathetic, which is your peaceful rest and digest mode. Miss Jones, though, flipped into fight or flight and stayed in it all day long. So his conclusion from that study was it's not just our external circumstances. It's not just our boss or our spouse or the letter from the IRS or whatever that you're coming into contact with that day that's flipping us into fight or flight. People have a belief system internally that causes them to interpret those circumstances in a certain way. And certain people's beliefs allow them to be at peace, and other people, their belief doesn't allow them to be at peace. And those people spend their whole life trying to force and manipulate, micromanage all their external environmental circumstances to force this state of peace, which even at that, I would say is not true peace. It might be some level of happiness. If you can have enough money, enough security, enough protection or whatever, provision and protection usually is what this boils down to. It's a false sense of security because, as we can see, when the stock market can crash by 50% in 2 weeks, when the food supply and toilet paper can be totally wiped out in a day or two, when you can be quarantined, you can only control your external environment and circumstances so much. So I don't recommend that. Do what you can, do what you're supposed to do, but you can never pile up enough money and resources to give you true peace. So this is a part of the talk that shifts more into a personal belief system. And what Bruce Lipton will say in his book, Biology of Belief, he basically leaves it at, hey, there's the truth and there's the false beliefs. So people that have a false belief, they're going to flip into fight or flight when circumstances come up. And if people's thoughts are truth, based in the truth, and they won't flip into fight or flights. Well, that gets into, okay, well, then what's truth? Is Buddha or Hindu or this or that or Jesus? Who has the truth? So I know this is more of a personal part of this, and I'm going to share with you my personal thoughts. Again, not trying to tell you how to think, but I would encourage you to really pursue, especially if you're stuck in a state of fight or flight. You seem to be perpetually in this state of lack of peace. I would consider you really dive into this and pray about this, regardless of what your belief system is. And we'll talk more about that. But a little more on the science. Caroline Leaf, and she really blends science and the biblical perspective on things, which is my perspective, in her book. So I'd highly recommend that, especially if if you are a believer, but even if you're not. She has amazing science that really backs up what Scripture says. So in her research, she points out in the book, 75 to 98% of all mental, physical, and behavioral illness is from one's thought life. That was from a Harvard study. The DNA changes shape according to your thoughts. Anger, fear, frustration will cause DNA to tighten up and become shorter and harder to express certain genes. And that DNA tightening was reversed by feelings of love, joy, appreciation, and gratitude. I just want to remind y'all, I'm not going to go through the whole water thing again, but go back and look at that video if you don't remember on the hydration lecture. The intracellular water, the water inside your cells, is H3O2, not H2O. It's called structured water. Gerald Pollack, University of Washington, as you remember, discovered this. And this type of water is more like a gelatin. Think of Jell-O. So it has more of this gelatin-like nature to it. It's not solid and it's not liquid. It's this in-between phase. That type of water is what is encasing that double helix DNA. That water is what's encasing the mitochondria, your carburetor that makes your energy. That water is encasing every receptor, every protein in the cell, your lysosomes, which are the garbage men inside the cell that clean up all your cellular debris. Everything, the enzymes that come in and put out the free radicals, those are encased in this water. Everything's encased in this water. The structure of that water changes based off your thoughts and based off if that thought is based in anger and unforgiveness and hatred and bitterness versus joy and love and peaceful. That's what Dr. Emoto found in his work. And then Dr. Montagnier and Jacques Benveniste with homeopathy, they found that this water holds memory. So that memory of that person when you were whatever age and they did something and you haven't forgiven them and that induced bitterness or whatever, that whole emotion and memory, that memory is stored in the water. That memory is impacting the structure, the physical structure of that water, which impacts the DNA and everything else in the water. So this is where the real interface comes in between the supernatural, the spiritual, the part that we can't see, touch, or feel. This is where the interface is with the physical. It's at the water. And that water impacts everything about your cell. So just want to remind y'all of that. These thoughts have a direct impact on your physical nature. So shifting more into my personal belief system, and a little bit of my personal story. Again, this is just my story. Take away from it what you will. I was raised in a Christian home, Christian church, a Baptist church in the middle of the Bible Belt. Went to church every Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening. My granddads were deacons. My parents were highly involved with teaching the kids choir and vacation Bible school and Sunday school and all these things. So I was raised in that religion and basically just had my parents' religion from that standpoint because that was my culture. That's what I was raised in. And then I went into the culture of higher education. And even though it was the number one leading or the largest Baptist university in the world, Baylor University, it was still very secular in the science department. In fact, my first professor, freshman biology, said, if you're not an evolutionist or don't believe in evolution, you can't be a scientist. He was just point blank about it. And it's just a constant evolutionary theory pounded into you all through college, all through medical school, and outside of college, just our world, the culture, the news, the movies, the media. It's just a bombardment of we evolved out of pond scum. That, to me, that thought is at the root of really this whole COVID-19 response. But so many of our responses in science and medicine is based out of this thought that we just came spontaneously out of nothing. All this matter, all this everything just appeared one day out of nothing, which that breaks every known law. You can't just have something come from nothing. And then that nothing somehow organized itself into this amazing, intricate creation. And I'm not going to go into a deep dive in all the science of how that's just completely ridiculous. We just look at a caterpillar turn into a butterfly and case closed. But that's what I was in. I was that mindset of we've evolved out of pond scum and we're not highly evolved enough yet. So we're still this being, this species, it's not highly evolved enough yet, so therefore we have disease and sickness, and the only thing to do about that is man-made inputs, pharmaceuticals and surgeries to try to manipulate that thing and try to make you feel better until we're highly evolved enough where maybe we can get out of this disease state. And I've shown clearly that genes and epigenetics rule over the genes. It's all about the environment. But the point being that evolutionary thought process is pervasive. It's in everyone. So one day I was reading in Scripture in Matthew, and it said, "Seek ye first the kingdom, then all these things will be given unto you." I was at that verse because we were having trouble getting pregnant. We had one kiddo, got pregnant very easily with our first baby, and then we couldn't get pregnant as a year, and then we did fertility treatments for a year, and so we're 2 years into this, nothing. And I read that verse, "Seek ye first the kingdom." Didn't know what that even meant really, but I sure prayed on it and asked God to show me what does that even mean, and boom. And that was 7 years ago, and 5 kids later, here we are. So we got pregnant right away after that, and I won't go into that whole thing. But where I'm going at is God started bringing these scientists into my world. So geneticists and nanophysicists and quantum physicists and biochemists, all these amazing guys that had studied deeply the human body and how a cell works and genetics and all this stuff. And they were all coming back with the exact same thing as Ben. It's so clear. Let me show you how. There's no way this evolutionary theory works. There is no one has ever seen any genetic mutation add information, add higher function. None. Much less enough to get all the way from pond scum to where we are now, and the diversity of that. And again, I'm not going to get into creation versus evolution here. I'm just telling you from my standpoint, God introduced me to a lot of these doctors. I put this book here by Dr. Rupert Sheldrake up, Science Set Free. And Sheldrake doesn't believe the same beliefs I do from a spiritual standpoint. But the point of this book, for those of you who are submitted to or handcuffed to or blinded to or following this faith, this science I call, or this God I call science, a false God. Science is not God. Science is here to observe God's creation, and that's it. It's observation. Once we start making assumptions and jumping to conclusions in our own thinking, that's where we get off, like cholesterol causes heart disease, therefore I need to give a drug to block cholesterol production, and boom. When we start thinking and making assumptions and guesses, that's where the things go haywire. So what Sheldrake does in this book, if you are under that deception that science knows everything, read the book. And because what I love is he goes through the top 10 dogmas of science, what we thought were just known for sure laws of science, like the constants, like gravity and speed of light. These are constants. They are just known constants, and he shows clearly in the book that they're not. They're not constants. The law of conservation of mass and energy. Mass and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. But then wait a minute. Recently, the scientists have noticed that way out in outer space, the stars and the galaxies are moving closer together at some inappropriate speed. It does not fit our Newtonian physics equations. And so our observations showed clearly that these constants and these things we thought we knew were wrong. So to make the equations work, they had to add energy and matter into the equations. We call it dark energy and dark matter. And Sheldrake talks about how 96 or 98% of all energy in the universe now is this dark energy, which dark energy is just a made-up term. No one's measured it. No one can see it or in any way quantify it. It's a number we made up to make the equations work. The point of the book being that all these things we thought we knew so much about in science, we really don't. And he was trying to set science free from these dogmas and open our mind to start thinking differently. But where the different thinking is going to lead is into the quantum physics realm, or outside of time and space, which is where quantum physics takes you. And that's the supranatural. It's outside the natural. It's above the natural. And it's clear if you take an unbiased, purely scientific look at this observationally, there are things happening on a subatomic level that we cannot see, touch, feel, or taste. We can't, with our natural abilities, quantify it. It's all mathematical kind of assumptions that quantum physicists have to make. And I'll take you as far as I believe they've gone, and to try to intellectualize and conceptualize what I'm talking about here. If you take an atom of, say carbon or hydrogen or nitrogen. These are the molecules that make up your eyeballs and your skin and your lungs and your heart and your muscle and your bone. You get down to a low enough level, we're all just made of atoms. The periodic chart that you learned about in high school. So we're atomic beings, we're made of atoms. What's an atom made of? Well, there's the nucleus as protons and neutrons. So neutral particles and positive particles in the nucleus. And then there's electrons that buzz around that nucleus. Electrons are negatively charged particles, and they're in motion. A negatively charged particle in motion creates a magnetic field of frequency. We can measure this. And we used to think those were the smallest particles known to man, these protons, neutrons, electrons. But then we figured out, science evolved, enough technology evolved to be able to see that there were subatomic particles called quarks, and then tachyons and fermions, and you go down low enough, and these particles start behaving and acting like not particles. They're not distinct, definitive particles. They're actually waves. They start behaving like a wave of energy. So just like your cell phone, how does it communicate your voice to a cell tower, then to your friend in London? These are waves, energetic waves. How does a microwave work? How does X-rays work? So how does an EKG read your heartbeat? It's reading the electricity, the energetic waves. So when you go down deep enough, we're really just waves of energy. And that gets into the quantum realm, and those energetic waves are influenced by our thoughts. That's how this thing connects. So release yourself from just the natural, from just the thought that everything is what we can see, touch, feel, and taste. There is this supernatural realm. I turned to this book. I call it the quantum physics book, although that word's not used in Scripture. But in my mind, this is the most amazing quantum physics book, and just amazing piece of literature in general. So take off your religious goggles, no matter what faith you were raised in. Christian, Muslim, Hindu, atheist, whatever. Just look at this book from the standpoint of science, or just observing what we do know about it. And the graph, hopefully you can see, you can zoom in and see some of this stuff. This is just, so I'm talking about the Bible, which is really, I wrote here 66 books put together into one. And these books, each individually, were written over 1,500 years by 40 different authors in 3 different languages on 3 different continents. Just that right there is pretty darn amazing. To try to construct something that actually makes sense and tells one unified story when you put all 66 books together, that's incredible. But even deeper than that, some of these books written 1,000 years or 500 years before some of the other books make predictions, very, very specific predictions that 500 years later come true, proven by extra biblical sources. So things outside the Bible that prove and confirm the exact same thing. So it's amazing if you just study it with that unbiased, more of an analytical, scientific mind, what you'll come away with. And what I come away with is what Vodi Bachman, this quote here at the bottom: "The Bible is a reliable collection of historical documents written down by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses that report supernatural events which took place in fulfillment of specific prophecies." And Dr. Stoner at Stanford looked at those specific prophecies, and he put math to it, did a statistical analysis. What are the odds that some guy, Isaiah, could write a book with 10 different prophecies, and they all came true 500 years later, were fulfilled by one man? He did the statistical analysis of that, and it was 10 to the X power, I forget the numbers, but look it up, Professor Stoner at Stanford, and it was infinitesimal. It was like infinity. The odds of this happening were just, there's no way. It could have not happened, or could have happened randomly. But the chart here looks at all these different authors and different works of literature throughout time, and how nobody questioned Caesar or Aristotle's work or the Iliad. And you compare when the earliest manuscript was of these different things, and the time between when the person lived and when that manuscript, approximate time span between an original and a copy, and the earliest copy we have compared to when they lived, and the number of copies. I mean, it's very, very scant when it comes to all these, Plato and all these other people. And you get to the New Testament, and it's overwhelming. The time between when the events occurred and when the first copy was written is very short compared to all the others, and how many copies there were. It's the odds of the accuracy of it are astronomical compared to everything else. And my point is, we don't question any of those other ancient texts. Why would we question the Bible? These two guys, though, are really, these are two of the other guys, besides the scientists that I interacted with early on after I started seeking the kingdom. It was Lee Strobel here and J. Warner Wallace. And I'd highly recommend you look into these guys if you're an agnostic, atheist, or a believer even, who has doubt and unbelief that they struggle with. So both these guys were agnostic or atheists. Their wives started going to church, a Christian church. They wanted to prove their wife wrong, so they used their journalistic techniques. In the case of Lee Strobel, he was an investigative journalist, Chicago Tribune or Sun-Times, I forget. I think he was even the editor there. And so he thought, I'll just use all my skills as a journalist to prove the Bible is not true and prove Christianity is not true. And he went and interviewed leading experts around the world and took a deep dive with all his journalism expertise. And it turned out it changed him. He absolutely believes in the Bible. And so his book, A Case for Christ, and another one, A Case for Faith, excellent reads. I'd highly recommend it. And then J. Warner Wallace, he's a cold case detective with the Los Angeles Police Department. He basically did the same thing. His wife started going to church. He wanted to prove her. He went to just support her. He heard a message from the preacher, and he thought, oh, that's intriguing. This guy's describing written documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses about historical events and about a murder, and it was just exactly what he does every day in the Los Angeles Police Department. He's studying these historical documents from 30 years ago when the person who allegedly committed the murder or the murder victim and even the policeman that interviewed the victim and all the witnesses, everybody's dead. So he's just looking at written accounts. And there's certain skills and techniques a cold case detective uses. Bottom line, he came to the same conclusion. This is amazing. This literature called the Bible and the Gospels in particular absolutely are true based off his intellectual analysis from a cold case detective standpoint. So I highly encourage y'all to look at that. Last thing I want to end on, and this is really for those who have submitted to and come to the conclusion that the Bible is a reliable Word of God and it's truth and it's full of amazing instruction on how to live. And remember, what I'm getting at is our goggles. How do we look at life? How do we look at these circumstances that are coming at us? How do we look at COVID-19? How do we look at my child's death prematurely? How do I look at my business's bankruptcy? All these bad things that happen. How am I going to interpret it? How am I going to be at peace despite my circumstances? So remember, that's where we're going. You can just be in stress management mode, but if we really want to flip our goggles into some goggles that allow us to interpret things in a manner that keep us at peace, I would submit to you to consider you really need to, it's the Bible that will allow you this truth. So Bruce Lipton called it false beliefs versus truth. And if this book is true, which I believe it is, and you can really implement and submit to and believe in and have faith in these concepts, then it can lead to true peace. So for those that already are there, I would recommend you look at these verses that I've pointed out here, because where I was left for most of my growing up years in the church was very shallow in my thinking. I was still being rocked by circumstances. My goggles were not fully lined up with the truth because I had no maturity and I had no understanding of some deeper biblical truth. And so I would encourage you, if that's you, if that describes you and you're a believer, but you're still being rocked by circumstances or not in a state of peace, look at this whole spirit versus soul versus body. And once you start to see that the body's just the body, it's the flesh, and your heart, your gut, your brain, your neurons, your hormones, all those are just molecules, physical things. They're being driven or instructed from thoughts that are either lined up with your soul, and the soul is influenced by everything, I'll say. Your upbringing, your parents, your culture, the media, your memories, events that happen in your life, and the memory of that event has not been lined up with the truth. Or your body's going to be driven by thoughts that come from the Spirit. And from a biblical standpoint, your spirit is lined up with the truth, which is the Holy Spirit. When you can see things through God's perspective, with His viewpoint, and you can truly submit to that and believe that, then it will drive this peace that drives your body and your body's physiology. It's basically that simple. If you're looking at things through your soul goggles, which are influenced by the enemy to God and all these other worldly things, that will make you prone to fight or flight mode. And if you're looking at it through a spiritual standpoint from the truth, which is the Word, Jesus, Scripture says Jesus is the truth, the way, and the life. When you see things through God's perspective, and no one's going to do this perfectly 100% of the time, all the time, with every circumstance. No, I mean, Jesus did, but nobody else will. But we can get better and better and better at it, and more mature in this, and we can get there quicker, and we can repent quicker when we are thinking soulishly. And again, this isn't a deep dive into that. That'll be in other videos later, but this is just some encouragement for those who feel like they've been praying, they've been in the Word, they've been going to church or doing whatever your religion tells you to do, but you're still in that state. Look at these verses, 1 Thessalonians 5:23 and Mark 14:34 and Genesis 3:5 and Hebrews 4:12, and consider the soul versus spirit. And then you may consider also Soul Care, is a great book by Rob Reimer. Of course, I already mentioned Biology of Belief and Switch on Your Brain. Those are great. Memory Code is a good one too, and he really talks about the memory. He doesn't get so much into the water like we've gotten into, but he shows clearly how your memories, it doesn't have to be traumas. It can just be like a performance mindset. If you feel like your love and value is based in your performance, and usually that's coming out of some memories of in your childhood you were rewarded for good performance, so then you relate your self-worth to performance. So you got to go back and fix those memories. And he has a way to do that. He calls it memory re-engineering. But again, I'm coming at it from a biblical perspective, and Soul Care kind of does the same thing. And it really talks about how you can get your soul to line up with or submit to the Spirit, submit to the truth. So some great resources there. The wellness navigators are also great resources, people that understand this and have walked through some of this personally, and can give you some more guidance and direction. They're not counselors, they're encouragers, they're navigators. They're just people that have the grace and the gifting and the calling to help people get well. So yep, they can help you with your nutrition, your hydration, your movement, but they can even speak to even just stress management if that's where you're at, but in the right timing, and if you're willing and you want to and you feel led to go deeper into your thoughts and where these thoughts coming from that are driving fight or flight, you could talk to your wellness navigator or one of the wellness navigators about that. So that was a lot and seemed like kind of, to me, a little superficial, but hopefully it was enough meat to make it make sense to you. And the number one take-home message is you cannot be fully well with just nutrition, hydration, and movement and stress management. You can get a long ways down the road. And we have helped a lot of people with just those three things, even just nutrition. You can get improvement, obviously. You will decrease inflammation if you can get your minerals up, and you can get your fat up, and you can get your processed food down, and you can start moving, and you can narrow the eating window, and all the things we've talked about, and hydrate well, and get outside. These are all beneficial things. So it's not an either or. Do it all, including dive deeper into this peace pillar. And ultimately, if patients don't get better at our clinic, it tends to be that their peace is just not there. And when I talk to other integrative physicians around the country, that's the resounding common denominator. When people are stuck or they start kind of doctor shopping, jumping from one clinic to the next, looking for the next answer or someone to help them or someone else to fix them, all these doctors will tell the same thing. You know, I'll call them up to talk about, say, chronic Lyme disease. And we'll talk and share stories and protocols, and you know, maybe we'll try a different protocol on a patient that's not responding. But ultimately, all these doctors say the same thing. Non-responders, these patients that just can't get well, there's a spiritual component. There's an unresolved emotional conflict and a spiritual component. So it's clear, everyone understands this, and it's more a matter of what are we going to do about it? Are we just going to manage it versus fix it? So encourage y'all to dive deeper and to fix it. And again, not trying to put my beliefs onto y'all, but I also don't feel like I'm doing you a service if I don't fully share with you, my testimony and the journey we've been on and what we've seen with patients who get all the way better. So I think that's a wrap. It's past time. Be at peace. COVID's nor anything can kill you. God numbers our days. He's the one that breathed life into us. He's the one that calls our spirit home. Our flesh is just the flesh. It'll fall over dead when our spirit's called home. So this is all about quality of life in between those days, the day you got put here and the day you're going home. So fear nothing, be anxious for nothing, walk in the truth, be free. The truth will set you free. And then go be a light to the world. All right, submit some questions through the Wellness Navigators for next week, and I'll come up with some of my own too of commonly asked questions, and we can just review everything next week. Thank y'all for being with us. See you next time.